Okay, welcome to the Silicon Valley Smart Life Health Institute Smart Life Forum, and the topic tonight is natural antiviral self-defense. And in the top of the chat window, there's a link to the Silicon Valley Health Institute if you'd like to make a donation. They'd appreciate it. It's a nonprofit organization, and they have decades of recordings of health-related speakers. So by all means, if you don't know about them, check them out. Also at the top is a link to my Patreon site where I'm writing the book that contains a lot of the information I'll be presenting here. And if you want to join that and get the book, it costs you $1. So it's very, very expensive. Okay, so I'd like everybody to stay muted as a rule so that we get the best quality audio track for this recording. If you have a question that comes up during the talk, and I'm sure you will, please type it into the chat window. If you don't see the chat window to the right of your screen, then you should move your cursor onto the Zoom window and then click on chat at the very bottom center of your screen. So Randy will be monitoring that chat window, and when I open it up for questions 3 or 4 times during the talk, he can then relay your question to me for me to answer it during that time, or you can request that you want to ask the question yourself. In which case, you unmute yourself and ask the question when Randy says to do that.
And we'll try the raise hand thing too. I don't know, we'll see if that.
Yeah, I haven't figured that part out yet. I don't know how to raise my hand. I do know how to clap.
It's right there at the top of the chat window. It says raise hand. So, but I'm not sure who can see it. We'll find out. Please proceed.
Okay, well, I don't see it, but that's okay. I don't have to see it. I don't have to raise my hand. So I'm going to talk about 20 minutes about general comments, and I'm going to start my discussion of vitamin D, and I'll keep it very, very short, and I'm going to open it up to Bill Grant, who's a world-class vitamin D researcher, to add his take on vitamin D. And then we'll open it up for questions for the two of us. And then I'll go on and talk about several other antiviral strategies, natural antiviral strategies, and then open that up for questions before going into vitamin C. And vitamin C is going to be a fairly lengthy discussion. This is the technique that is the way to bring the COVID mortality as close to 0 as you want, depending upon the dose. And so it's going to be a major part of my presentation. And then we'll open it up for discussion again after that vitamin C part is finished. And then if I have time, I'll talk about metabolic rate as a risk factor for COVID infections and what we can do about that.
So there was a request maybe for a further introduction. Let's see, was that? I think that was from Beth. I don't know. Is there anything else you want to say about yourself before you proceed?
Okay, well, I'm all over the internet. I'm famous or infamous, depending upon how you look at it. I'm an organic chemist by academic training. I'm a biochemist and neurochemist by inclination and study. I've written, this is my 7th book that I'm writing, so I've been fairly prolific. I've done 2 different newsletters, one with about 30, I think 3 dozen newsletters in my first newsletter that I did. And then when I took over the Cognitive Enhancement Research Institute, we published 72 newsletters. All that CERI content, the Cognitive Enhancement Research Institute, is all available online thanks to the patronage of Phil Jacklin. He paid to put all of those issues to be scanned and put online. I participate in Quora, so if you want to get an idea of the kind of content that I generate, that's a good place to check it out. I also have a YouTube channel where I talk about how to prevent and reverse Alzheimer's disease. And it turns out that that relates directly to this subject here. So when I get to talking about the redox buffering system of the human body, which is pretty much ignored by medical researchers and clinicians, it turns out that that's a precipitating factor for Alzheimer's disease, for autism, and for sudden infant death syndrome. I won't be able to talk about that during this talk, but I'm just mentioning it's there because this is the kind of thing that I do, is I dig into the scientific literature and find stuff and draw kind of a meta level understanding of what's going on in certain pathologies, and then put it out there for the world to adopt or not. The advantage of this presentation is that I'm going to tell you how to biohack coronavirus on your own. So the idea is with the vitamin C, I'm going to tell you how to implement a near intravenous protocol that you can do with oral vitamin C at home so that you don't have to put your life at risk by checking into a hospital. This has now been demonstrated in China and in hospitals in the United States that are, in a sense, it's a renegade use of vitamin C protocols by doctors who are not following the recommended advice of the FDA and the CDC and the NIH. So I think we can think about the coronavirus epidemic as uncovering our pre-existing conditions. So we know that obesity and diabetes and old age are risk factors for coronavirus mortality. We know that vitamin D and vitamin A deficiencies and selenium deficiencies and vitamin C insufficiencies are also risk factors. But the point is that there's a lot of invisible pre-existing conditions that are showing up as people catch coronavirus infections, and it runs its course. A lot of people are dying that some people are surprised about. There was one report of a woman who was like in her early 30s who died from coronavirus, and it was a big reported news story in the mainline media, and where they said she had no pre-existing conditions, and it turns out that she weighed way more than 200 pounds. She was obese, but they didn't consider that a pre-existing condition. So there are a lot of things like insulin resistance, for example, where you go into your doctor and you get a blood test, and your fasting insulin level is between 90 and 99, and the doctor says you're okay, you're not diabetic yet, but watch it. Well, that's kind of tolerated, and yet in terms of coronavirus, fasting blood sugar of 99 is a risk factor. So a lot of these things, we walk around, as I say in the book, hypometabolic individuals are walking around as if there was nothing, they're allowed to walk around as if there was nothing wrong with them. That's a quote from the Jack Dancer sermons about theophobia as a psychological condition. But it's true that there's probably the case that almost all Americans have pre-existing conditions, and many of them are nutritional and easily treated. So, for example, vitamin D. The incidence of vitamin D insufficiency is probably more than half of our population, at least in terms of an optimization view, where you're talking about, let's say, the conservative one at 30 to 40 nanograms per milliliter, as kind of a leveling off of the benefits to vitamin D to maybe 50 to 60 nanograms per milliliter for example, Native African Americans, the mean for Native African Americans living in a native lifestyle, that'll be somewhere around 50 nanograms per milliliter. And it does take a significant amount of sun to get that naturally. But when certain kinds of viral risk factors, when you're looking at, let's say, total mortality as an endpoint for risk, if you're between 0 and 10, your risk is incredibly high, between basically double or triple. And if you're between 20 and 30, or between 10 and 20, it's probably, double. And if you're between 20 and 30, it's probably, 20, 30, 40%. And then if you're above 30 and 30 to 40 range, it bottoms out at the reference risk for most people. And then it's pretty much flat from 40 on up. And so it suggests that there is this sweet spot that for people who don't have a particular health challenge, that for overall health and well-being, that you want to be above 30 and maybe even above 40. But my question is, what if you consider a health challenge? What is the optimum dose of vitamin D when you are, you have the coronavirus on board, or you have influenza on board, or you have just suffered second-degree burns on a lot of your body? And in those kinds of situations, there's a lot less research on it, but I'm hoping that Bill will be able to address that if there is some research about it that I don't know about. So what I'm going to be talking about is a kind of strategy for dealing with viral risks and other kinds of risks that are about a kind of a return to Mother Nature concept. So in terms of diet, going back to a natural diet, to, for example, avoid processed and aged foods. So processed foods would be things like flour. Aged foods would be things like sharp cheeses. Return to a natural diet to avoid genetically modified foods, where there are antigens present in those foods that we have not been exposed to. That also would involve things like intermittent fasting, where you flirt with beta oxidation and ketosis as metabolic states that many Americans have never experienced in their entire life. Even partial fasting is a way of helping to induce autophagy mechanisms that turn out to be significantly affected by vitamin D status and by protein restriction in the diet. So that would be, for example, total fasting, or partial fasting, where you're still allowed to, for example, include fat as an energy source, where you're just restricting protein and carbs, or primarily restricting those. Autophagy is when your body does self-digestion, auto meaning self and phagy meaning digestion. And so when you go into autophagy, your body starts to conserve resources. It starts to recycle, for example, senescent mitochondria and garbage proteins that may be sitting around in the cell. It also digests DNA and RNA that are out in the cell, which is what you're dealing with when you have an RNA virus like coronavirus on board. You have all of these viral mechanisms running in the cell that can be broken down and digested to reduce the effect of the virus. So you're actually interfering with the viral manufacturing process in your cells by going into autophagy. And this is not an unnatural thing. This happens all the time when we get sick enough that we don't eat. So vitamin D may play into that. as well. But the idea is that we take metabolic exercise as seriously as physical exercise, so that we have the adaptive capacity for responding to a viral infection as strongly as we can and as rapidly as we can, instead of having, you know, metabolic problems getting in the way of the immune system's response to a pathogen. Your immune system can respond as rapidly as possible in the shortest amount of time frame. Martha, can you mute yourself? Okay, mission accomplished. Oh, okay, good. So what I think is going on now is the brutal reality of pre-existing conditions is being brought to our attention. And it's potentially revolutionary in that we can take this differently than we have in the past. It's been a common practice to pretty much ignore those kinds of things and to let them slowly creep up on us to where when we hit our elderly years, we're very feeble and open to all kinds of potential problems. So the earlier we deal with these kinds of issues on a lifestyle basis, the better prepared we are when it really matters. So metabolic rate, if I have time, I'm gonna talk about that later. It turns out that metabolic rate is a major part of building the redox buffering system of the human body, which is the foundation of the antioxidant defense system. So your antioxidant defense system protects you against free radicals, but it only does so when your redox buffering system is strong and the pools of reducing equivalents are deep. Reducing is the opposite of oxidation. So an antioxidant would be like an umbrella protecting you from the sun, the direct rays of the sun. So you may still be uncomfortably warm, but at least you're not going to get sunburned and you're not going to get overheated from direct sun exposure. But a reducing agent or reducing equivalents in your redox buffering system, that's like a drink with ice in it, or like a refrigerator, something that's actually cold and it cools you off. An umbrella just keeps you from getting too hot, but something that's, you know, refrigeration and ice will actually cool you off when you're too hot. And that's what you need when you're dealing with the coronavirus. The coronavirus is a hot source. It's promoting free radical reactions. It's heating up the body like the sun would do with direct exposure. And the better your refrigeration system in your body is, the more sun you can expose yourself to with less consequences. So in terms of self-defense for viruses, one of the best things that you can do is to stop wearing rose-colored glasses. That's usually the phrase that talks about seeing the world, not as it is, but as you might want it to be. And to, in a sense, to restore 20/20 vision of really what vitamin C does in the human body. So that involves things like understanding the limitations and avoiding the opinions of crony science. This is the NIH and the CDC and the WHO who are putting forth information based on an elitist view of reality that isn't really about reality. So they say things like vitamin C doesn't work and there's no studies proving it works, and et cetera, et cetera. And I think it's pretty obvious, having read the literature and having spoken with dozens, if not more, physicians who have integrated vitamin C into their clinical practices successfully, and that's usually both intravenous vitamin C and oral vitamin C, that the death rate from coronavirus can be dropped to zero or as close to zero as you want to get, depending upon how big a dose you want to use. So somebody who's elderly with diabetes might take hundreds of grams, whereas somebody who's elderly and is otherwise playing tennis on a regular basis might only need 40 grams. But if you're willing to go to the higher and higher doses with the clinical worsening of symptoms, that you can pretty much rescue everybody, or at least the number of deaths would be way, way less than what you'd get from a normal flu season. One of the best books on the subject is Primal Panacea by Tom Levy. And he's a lawyer and a medical doctor, and he basically says that he doesn't know of any deaths where the protocol was to increase the dose with the severity of the illness for all of recorded human history. He's looked into studies and talked with doctors about it. So that's the promise that I'm dangling in front of you today, is that vitamin C has that potential to drop coronavirus deaths to zero. And I will give you, before the end of the day or the end of the talk, a formula for how to do that at home. It's not as good as true intravenous. You can't get to hundreds of grams, but you certainly can get to dozens of grams. And hopefully this will get me in this video censored on Facebook and YouTube. So one of the things that I've noticed in 40 years of looking at health and wellness and disease and therapy is that we live with a disease management industry. This is the way that the bureaucratization of the medical system, the centralization of medical authority, the embodiment of medical regulation, and the federalization of disease management, that's what it's given us. And the core of this is the profit motive. So you have doctors who are getting paid to manage diseases instead of cure them. And that requires a certain level of ignorance of natural healing mechanisms. So that's why I'm writing this book, and that's what I'm going to talk about in the course of this thing. So let me use vitamin C as an example of that. Vitamin C, how can vitamin C drop the death rate to near zero? And number one, it's an essential member of the redox buffering system. And it's a redox crisis that actually kills you. Two, the redox buffering system is the foundation of the antioxidant defense system. And you get, when that defense system malfunctions, you get all kinds of very serious pathology. The redox buffering system sets the reference point, number three, for the immune system. So it's the foundation for immune surveillance. It's the foundation for antigen presentation. It's the foundation for the regulation of cell signaling factors. And when that goes wrong, you have cytokine storm. It's also the foundation for minimizing autoimmunity problems. And we have an epidemic for those, like we do for autism. And it turns out that both of those involve a compromised redox defense system or redox buffering system. And vitamin C is the weakest link in the redox buffering system. And that's because we don't make it. So a human being gets about less than 1% of the vitamin C level that other mammals produce. less than 1%. I supplement vitamin C at about 10%. So if you're not supplementing vitamin C, you're below 1%. So it's hard to run the redox defense system under challenge with 1%. Well, turns out that mammals, when they get sick, their vitamin C doubles. They double their production of vitamin C. And so you end up with a tiny fraction of that 1% when you're sick with coronavirus. So oxidative stress from an infection challenges all the different elements of the redox defense system, but it's vitamin C that is metabolically irreplaceable. And so that's why vitamin C deficiency is deadly, and why supplementing vitamin C allows the redox buffering system to survive an intense insult. So what do we know about the redox defense system, the redox buffering system? Vitamin D influences it. It influences metabolic rate, and it assists in innate immunity. Vitamin A regulates a lot of the health of mucous membranes, which would include your entire respiratory system, into your lungs, and your gut, where there's primary pathology from coronavirus. Selenium, these are factors I'm going to be talking about. Selenium, which is a trace element that's involved in defending the redox buffering system, turns out that there are areas of the world that are grossly deficient or insufficient in selenium, and China is one of them. So a lot of these super viruses come out of China because it's a heavily populated country with humans and animals, and it's selenium deficient, which also destabilizes genomes and allows them to do crossover events and to transfer from species to species better. Zinc and copper. I'll be talking about those as well. Copper is an antioxidant, and zinc is involved in the tight junction gaps of the gut for its integrity. Redox buffering I've already mentioned, but it's also for vitamin C. It's also important for collagen maturation, which is the part of our tissues that make our flesh tough and resistant to bruising. Otherwise, we would look like jellyfish, all transparent and floppy. It's also part of immune system activation. The reference between your redox potential normally and the redox potential of an infection is what your immune system uses to judge how it's responding. Okay, so if you want a copy of this, I'm going to do a screen share. Let's see. Your screen. Oh, maybe I can share just that. Can you guys see a big red circle?
Yes, in the monitor.
Yeah, we can see that.
Okay. This is my illustration talking about or presenting the basic structure of the redox buffering system. So the big circle represents your bodies. On the left of the vertical line is your cellular defense, and on the right is your tissue level defense. And the little bump that's sticking out in the body is your mitochondria. And your mitochondria is producing the NADH and NADPH of the blue layer, which is the cooling off effect of the redox buffering system. The red represents heat and oxidative stress and free radicals, and that's the most of the redox environment. We live in the green zone. It's way down near the bottom. You see GSH, glutathione, is much, 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 much greater than oxidized glutathione. And the layer above it, your vitamin C, is much, much higher than dehydroascorbate, which is oxidized vitamin C. So we live in that green zone, which is way down at the bottom of the chart. The yellow zone is where we move when we catch a virus or have a second-degree burn and things like that. And the orange zone is untenable. Usually, if we ever get up that high, we're dead. So this is the challenge of the redox buffering system, is keeping things cooled off by the blue zone to support the darker green zone, which is where we want to live. Okay, if you want to copy this, if you've got a Mac, you can hit Command-Shift-4 and drag the cursor diagonally across the illustration. And if you have a PC, I think it's Control-Shift-S for activating the rectangular select mode, and you can grab this. Or you can go to Patreon and get the book, which has this illustration in it.
Oh yeah, one of the people pointed out that there's a lot of text on the left-hand side that's sort of cut off, so.
Yeah, that's because this is a screen grab of the book.
Oh, okay, all right, but yeah.
Yeah, so this is just the illustration, which allows you to visualize how the system is working. And unlike pH, acidity and alkalinity, where we live smack in the middle, the redox system, we live towards an extreme. And that means we're spending huge amounts of energy to maintain this reduced state of being. Okay. Bill, I'm going to give you a heads up. We're getting fairly close to this. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about vitamin D before I introduce Bill. It's the sunshine hormone. So it's basically a hormone that is produced by the action of sunlight, ultraviolet B sunlight on a substance called 7-dehydrocholesterol, which is in our skin. And vitamin D deficiency is widespread. And it's widespread in China, and it's widespread in the United States. It's widespread in Asian cultures, and it's an epidemic for all of it's endemic in the world because we're being taught to avoid the sun. And many of the industry spokespeople in the dermatology field mistakenly tell people that avoiding the sun will lower your risk of skin cancer, and that's not true. And in some areas of the world, the culture is white skin is better than dark skin, and so avoiding the sun is good for you in terms of being as white as you can possibly be. Low vitamin D levels are associated with cardiovascular morbidity and mortality, stroke morbidity and mortality, increased colds and flus, COVID-19 complications, respiratory failure and death, subclinical effects on bone mineralization. So the assumptions that for vitamin D preventing rickets is not just the only thing that vitamin D does for bone. Compromised immune system function, infectious disease severity, and autoimmune incidence. Vitamin D, the lower your vitamin D, the higher your cancer risks. And it's associated with all-cause mortality. Doses vary from 2K as on the low end to 5,000 units kind of in the middle, to maybe 12,000 units at the top end. for people with very dark skin and people living at high latitudes, low altitudes, living with smog, and depending upon the season of the year. So if it's winter, you need more vitamin D supplementation to keep your level high than if it's summer. You cannot feel vitamin D, so get yourself tested so you know. Bill Grant will now give us a presentation of his expertise. He's a world-class expert on the science of vitamin D. Bill, take it away.
Thank you, and thank you for your introduction and your good comments on various aspects of this topic. So I've been studying ultraviolet B radiation and vitamin D for about 20 years. I started when I was still working for NASA in Virginia, decided I want to do this full time and get away from atmospheric studies. So moved to San Francisco and been doing this full time for the last 16 years here in San Francisco. The reason I'm able to talk about this topic today is that I was the organizer of a manuscript that was just published in Nutrients about 6 weeks ago on the evidence that vitamin D could reduce the risk of influenza and COVID-19. This is open access paper. It can be found at pubmed.gov or scholar.google.com or at Nutrients. It already has 72 citations, so it's the most popular article published to date on vitamin D and COVID-19. So let me, first of all, why is COVID-19 and influenza more common in winter than in summer? That's because our vitamin D levels are lower, but also because there's the temperature is low, the humidity is low, and viruses can live outside the body longer in those conditions. When it becomes summer with a lot of sun, higher temperature, higher humidity, the virus will have a very short lifetime outside the body, out of doors. So we're going to see a continued drop-off in COVID-19 and influenza as the summer progresses, but it could come back in the fall. Now, just a couple words about vitamin D. As Steve said, it's made by UVB hitting a type of cholesterol in the skin. And this is the same type that we can take in, as supplements. Now, this goes through the blood to the liver, where it receives a hydroxyl group and becomes 25-hydroxy vitamin D. And that's what's measured when you measure your vitamin D level. You can have that done at your doctor's office, or if you want to do it another way, you can go to grassrootshealth.net and sign up for a blood spot test. They'll send you a kit, you draw some drops of blood and send it back, and in 2 weeks you have your level. So now the hormonal version of vitamin D is called 1,25-dihydroxy vitamin D, or calcitriol. That's made in the kidneys to help regulate the calcium levels in the blood in a very tight range. And it's also made in other organs as needed. For example, if an organ has cancer, it's going to start manufacturing more of this calcitriol. Now, vitamin D works primarily through genetics. It's the hormonal version can enter vitamin D receptors coupled to chromosomes in each cell. And when the the calcitriol enters the receptor, it can then affect gene expression, upregulate many genes as well as down-regulating some. Now, for respiratory tract infections such as influenza and COVID-19, vitamin D has several main functions. The first one is it reduces the survival and replication of viruses by inducing production of compounds such as cathelicidin and other defensins. These compounds have antimicrobial and anti-endotoxin properties, thus reducing the number of viruses or bacteria and protecting the body from the toxins generated by these viruses or bacteria. These compounds are mostly produced in the blood through interactions with white blood cells that fight infections. So the cathelicidins kill organisms by damaging and puncturing the cell membranes of organisms. The second thing they do, the vitamin D does, is it reduces the cytokine storm. So the body's innate immune system fights viral infections by producing chemical messengers called cytokines. Cytokines include chemokines, interferons, interleukins, lymphokines, and tumor necrosis factors. They act through cell surface receptors. Some of these cytokines cause inflammation, while others reduce inflammation. In the case of acute respiratory tract infections, such as influenza and COVID-19, the immune system can produce too many cytokines, resulting in the cytokine storm that is linked to damage to the lungs and internal organs. Vitamin D can modify the production of cytokines, reducing the production of the inflammatory cytokines, such as interleukin-6, and increasing production of the anti-inflammatory cytokines, such as IL-10. Now, when the lining of the lungs is damaged, pneumonia can develop from the ever-present bacteria and fungi entering the damaged cells of the lining of the lungs. Now, during the 1918-1919 pandemic influenza in the United States, the death following influenza infection was primarily from the ensuing pneumonia. In an analysis I performed and reported in 2009, the case fatality rates were lower in the parts of the country with the higher UVB doses in summer and in winter, i.e. the southwestern states have the highest UVB doses, especially in summer, and the Northeast has the lowest doses. So by analogy, it seems that similar results will be found for COVID-19. So when we published our manuscript, it was just a review based on what was known about respiratory tract infections and vitamin D. There was a number of papers that had been shown, for example, in 2017, that vitamin D supplementation can reduce the risk of acute respiratory tract infections, especially for people with vitamin D levels below 15 or 20, below 15 nanograms per milliliter. What we've seen now in the past few weeks are a whole series of observational studies from various countries. One of the first was from several, I think data from 3 Asian countries, which showed that those people who had less than 20 nanograms per milliliter, 25-hydroxyvitamin D, had very severe COVID-19 infections, whereas those who had serum 25-hydroxyvitamin D above 30 nanograms per milliliter had minor or less severe cases. What we showed in a preliminary version of our manuscript was results from Grassroots Health observational study, in which people can register with Grassroots Health, have their 25-hydroxyvitamin D measured every 6 months, and tell how much vitamin D they're taking, and then to report their health outcomes. Well, based on those data, it was found that it was those who had 25-hydroxyvitamin D above 40 nanograms per milliliter who had the lowest rates of influenza-like illnesses. So that's why we can say that above 40, say 40 to 60 nanograms per milliliter is where you want to be in order to avoid these respiratory tract infections. Now in the winter, the average average called vitamin D level now is around 20 nanograms per milliliter in the United States, whereas in the summer it goes up around 30. So if it's around 20, that means half the population is below 20, which means half the population is at risk. If you look at who's dying from COVID-19, especially in the United States, all the groups of people dying are people in groups that are vitamin D deficient. That includes the African Americans, the Hispanics, people in nursing homes who are indoors, they're not given vitamin D, people in prisons who are primarily African Americans, again, they're not given vitamin D. In New York, it was the transit workers, who a lot of those are African Americans working down in the dungeons, and their bosses frowned on them wearing masks. They were just admonished not to wear masks during the run-up to the COVID-19 thing. So unfortunately, we have, as Stephen pointed out, we have a disease management system, not a disease prevention system in the United States. And a couple of years ago, I learned about the disinformation playbook as applied by the tobacco industry, the sugar industry, the meat industry, the National Football League, and on, and written out by the United Union of Concerned Scientists. And they point out that there are 5 things that these corporations or these industries do to protect their turf and keep away things they don't like. And I asked, well, is this being done for vitamin D? You bet. First thing they do, one thing they do is they publish bad studies. So the doctors want to see clinical trials showing that vitamin D works before they will say, yes, it works. Unfortunately, most of the clinical trials conducted on vitamin D were based on vitamin D as a drug. And so they only looked at the dose. They didn't look at the serum 25-hydroxyvitamin D concentrations. And disease outcome is related to 25-hydroxyvitamin D, not vitamin D. So if you enroll people who have above average vitamin D level, give them a small amount of vitamin D, you're not going to find any effect. So for years they said, it doesn't reduce risk of cancer, cardiovascular disease, autoimmune disease, et cetera, et cetera. Well, if you're in the sun all day, like in Africa, you can make 10,000 to 20,000 IU per day and get your level up to around 40, 50 nanograms per milliliter. But if you live in San Francisco, where it's foggy all summer, you live indoors, it's cloudy, et cetera, you're not making much vitamin D. So anyway, the clinical trials are not shown much because they're poorly designed. So the next thing they do in this disinformation playbook is they attack the leaders of the field. Well, the most prominent vitamin D guru in the United States is Michael Holick at Boston University. So about a year ago, the Kaiser Family Foundation published a hit piece in the New York Times saying that he was funded by the indoor tanning industry and vitamin companies, therefore he cannot be trusted. Well, hell, who funds the drug trials, which the doctors fund? It's the drug industry. Are they biased? Well, maybe. Another thing they do is the medical industry will fund the universities to do trials. They'll fund the all the media. They'll fund anybody they can, and so all these groups will then favor drug information and ignore vitamin D information. I've tried to get the CSF chronicle interested in vitamin D. They won't touch it with a 10-foot pole. There are beginning to be leaks in the news media. If you look around, you'll find in the Irish and the British newspapers, there's a little bit, Canadian newspapers a little bit, but it's really hard. Another thing they do, they'll put their people in power. So who's ahead of the CDC, the FDA, the NIH, et cetera, all people from the big pharma or the medical industry. There was an interesting case in South Carolina where the Medical University of South Carolina had been studying the high dose vitamin D, 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 IU per day for pregnant women. And they found that if the women got up to above 40 nanograms per milliliter, the preterm delivery rate was about half if you had less than 20 nanograms per milliliter. They went to a local March of Dimes and said, you ought to be endorsing vitamin D. They said, that's a great idea. They then had to check it out with the Atlanta regional office, and it came back from the regional office that, no, we don't think that's a good idea. And so the local people in South Carolina thought maybe we just didn't make a good enough case. So they strengthened the proposal, sent it back, and the answer came back, it's not only no, it's hell no. Turns out that there must have been people from the CDC on the board of the March of Dimes who then scotched it. So anyway, this disinformation playbook for vitamin D is published at the Orthomolecular Medicine News Service in 2018. Just go to their website and you can find it. So, okay, how much vitamin D do you need? It depends on the person. For example, I take 5,000 IU per day, and my 25-hydroxyvitamin D is around 72 nanograms per milliliter. There's a lot of personal variation depending on your absorption in your GI tract, your genes, your BMI, your age, et cetera, et cetera. So now, if you want to try to develop an immunity during the COVID-19 pandemic, and you haven't been taking vitamin D, you've got to be taking maybe 25, 50,000 IU per day for maybe a couple of weeks, and then drop back to 5,000, 10,000 IU. That's a matter, you can jack up the vitamin D. The half-life of vitamin D is around 2 weeks. The half-life of the 25-hydroxyvitamin D is around 2 weeks. So once you get set up, you can then slow down a bit. Now, in terms of if you start getting the symptoms of COVID-19, what Henry Lahore found at vitamindwiki.com was when his wife got the first symptoms of COVID-19, he gave her maybe 300,000 IU of vitamin D on an oral base, applied to the skin, transdermal application. She woke up the next morning, the symptoms were gone. However, if you wait a week or two, you wait until a cytokine storm is set in, until your organs get damaged, et cetera, it's probably too late for vitamin D. I mean, it's maybe help a little bit, but you really got to do this. You want to prevent it, treat it early, or not. So that's what I have to say.
Thank you, Bill. Very, very useful. Yeah, I hadn't heard that story about vitamin D in the earliest stages of infection being so effective. So do you think that that's mediated through cathelicidin?
It's probably that plus switching downregulating the pro-inflammatory cytokines. It's going to prevent what's going to try to reduce the source of the cytokines, which is the infection, as well. And that's probably what the main thing there. But
okay, because vitamin C and glutathione do that as well.
Okay.
Yeah,
so has to do with the
whole reducing agent thing seems to dramatically re-regulate the cell signaling mechanisms. Mm-hmm. So at this point, Randy, do we have any questions that I'm going to open it up for questions to relating to vitamin D or anything discussed so far before we move on to talk about other things. And so, Bill, if you can hang out with us for this, I'd appreciate it.
I'll stay.
All right.
I have a question or a comment, if I may. The people that take vitamin D supplement, I think it's highly recommended to also take K2. And there is an issue with vitamin D being absorbed in the wrong places in the body, and K2 pretty much prevents and makes sure that the vitamin D gets to the bone and other essential cells, as opposed to some organs that the vitamin D doesn't belong in terms of the calcium. So I've been taking vitamin D in conjunction with K2. I didn't really know about the high dosage of 20 or 30,000. I've been taking the 5,000. But the K2 is an essential part of the equation.
Okay, I could certainly answer that. And Bill, you have something to say about that?
Yes, John Cannell figured that out years ago, and I agree with that. But there's another important nutrient, and that's magnesium, because magnesium is involved in the enzymes that convert vitamin D to 25-hydroxyvitamin D. And also magnesium has many other functions. So if you take vitamin D without taking magnesium, you're going to be reducing your magnesium levels, which is not so good. And I found in my case, if I don't take enough magnesium, I get leg cramps in the middle of the night. If you're taking magnesium, you should be taking some calcium as well. So it's sort of a fourth, you want calcium, magnesium, K2, and vitamin D.
Yeah, I also have had some conversations with Prendergast in Palo Alto, who was treating various conditions with Gila monster venom and vitamin D, very high doses of vitamin D, 50,000 a day for months at a time. And he followed a protocol where he deliberately didn't supplement calcium because he didn't want the calcium to be pushed that hard. But as far as I know, he wasn't using vitamin K. And I'd say that's a strong thing to cultivate. And it's not, I don't think I've seen any evidence that the vitamin K is affecting vitamin D directly, but what it is affecting is calcium utilization and storage in the tissues, so that the vitamin K is preventing the calcification of soft tissues and therefore promoting ossification of hard tissues, your bones.
Let me jump in here, Steve, and go back to, there was a pre-start question, which I think is relevant here.
Good.
Dean asks, if possible, can you discuss dosing as it relates to weight and body mass and gender? I'm 220 pounds and my partner is closer to 110. Bill, do you want to talk about that in relation to vitamin D at this point?
Yeah, I think that's why you get yourself tested. Do you have a healthy gallbladder and the ability to absorb fat soluble compounds? How much sun are you getting? How efficient are your kidneys at converting the 25 to the 125? I mean, there's so many highly individual factors that are involved with vitamin D that to take them all to make guesswork about it is really, I think, misguided.
So there's, let me add to that actually, because I looked this up recently and I found a paper that actually has a formula for, given your starting vitamin D, where you want to get to. It includes things like body mass index, and I'll try to find that and post it in the chat window.
Well, there's also issues of like what's going on with the weather. I mean, you know, like for example, if you have geographical information that's being used by the program that's predicting your issues, it has to take into account whether you live in, let's say, the Mission District of San Francisco, where you have huge amounts of sun with low levels of pollution, versus, let's say, Oakland, right across the bay, where all the San Francisco smog blows across the bay and stacks up into the hills, where in the summer, there may be very sunny days where you don't get any UVB or vitamin D.
Yep, those are correct. There's another, I'll say a comment and a question from Daniel, which he says, I think it took the British Navy 40 years to implement limes in their sailing fleet after a published study. So I think limes is more about scurvy, but nevertheless, it sort of points to the kind of thing. But it was a good question. So you talked, his question is, what about taking vitamin D3 without K2? Since you mentioned K2, now we probably have a number of people wondering, you know, do I need to run out and get K2 and I shouldn't take my vitamin D supplement or so? So how much of a concern is that really, as far as if you want to take K2, is that kind of an optimization, or how important do you feel that is?
I think it's fairly important. Bill?
I think it's more of an optimization. I take a little bit of K2 when I remember it, but I don't have any ossified tissues other than my bones. So,
well, you can tell to some extent, because if you have soft tissue calcification, your body complains to you with aches and pains. And if you get a deep tissue massage, it hurts. So, you know, that idea of looking at, for example, let's say you go into your doctor and you get a CT scan of your heart, a fast CT scan. Calcification of your blood vessels is that process of calcium being diverted from your hard tissues into your soft tissues. Mm-hmm. So you can look at that kind of calcium score. You can look at your, there's an ultrasound technique where you can look at your carotid artery, and the blood pulse that comes up your artery from your carotid artery from your heart causes the blood vessel to dilate and contract as the pulse goes through it. And the degree of soft tissue calcification prevents that from happening, and that can be measured with ultrasound. So there's a variety of ways to look at this, but K2 deficiency is not uncommon. So I would say it's important. The degree to which it is for you may be varied. Now, the other thing I'd like to point out is the K1 versus K2 issue. So the problem with vitamin K in general with somebody with an acute coronavirus infection or influenza infection is that their blood is shifting towards coagulation and clotting. And vitamin K1 and K2 are pro-clotting factors. So my concern is that you don't want to put a clotting factor on board when you have a clotting tendency. So my suggestion would be to take the K2 before you have a coronavirus infection and maybe stop during the infection and resume later if you're not taking active anticoagulation steps or anti-clotting steps. So anticoagulation might be something like nattokinase. So some of the vitamin C protocols will have low molecular weight heparin as part of the therapy because this thins out the blood and inhibits coagulation and clotting mechanisms. Well, you know, that's an IV therapy. It's overtly medical. You're not going to get that kind of thing at home, but nattokinase you can find all over the internet, and that will act as an anticoagulation influence.
Okay, we're starting to get a bunch of questions here. Let me see if I can. So maybe I could ask the speakers.
How about
the answers a little shorter.
How about two more questions?
Okay, okay, here's I'm going to combine two into one here, and then we'll find another. So one is a person who says they take 20,000 IUs a day. And is there a downside to taking too much? How much is too much? And I want to connect that with another question, which was, is there a particular brand that's a better brand than another? I mean, me personally, I just go by pretty much the cheapest thing I can find in the store, and I figure I'm good, but maybe I'm wrong about that. So what about that?
Okay, there was a famous case of a vitamin guru who wrote many books on nutrition and told his manufacturer to put 1,000 IU per day of vitamin D in his powder. Well, it's 40 international units per microgram, and the manufacturer confused milligrams with micrograms. So the powder, the scoop of powder had 1 million IU. He was taking a scoop per day for a few weeks and developed, couldn't think straight, had bloody feet, and had to stop his lecture circuit. Michael Hollett got involved and found out that he had a 25-hydroxy vitamin D concentration of 900 nanograms per milliliter.
Holy cow.
And they chelated him. I mean, they made him stop taking his powder and maybe try to get some ways to reduce the vitamin D. When his 25-hydroxy vitamin D dropped down to 400 nanograms per milliliter, hypercalcemia went away. So that gives one idea. There have been a number of observational studies that found that people with 80 to 100, with up to about 80 to 100 nanograms per milliliter had higher risk of disease than people in the middle and more like those in the lower values. Well, I solved that riddle by finding that women had the U-shaped relationship, whereas men didn't in terms of frailty. And so what I realized was that postmenopausal women are told to take vitamin D, whereas post-andrial, whatever, men are not told to take vitamin D. So the women who had been vitamin D deficient most of their lives all of a sudden were put in the wrong category in these observational studies and made these U-shaped relationships were just bogus because vitamin D supplementation studies have never found this U-shaped relationship.
Yeah, and you also pointed out in another one of your papers or one of your responses to somebody else's paper that as people get older and their mortality risks are naturally increasing because of age, they tend to be, the vitamin D recommendation tends to go up. And so therefore, the people who are supplementing at extreme ages show up as if they're, the vitamin D is higher, and yet they're dying because they're very elderly,
right,
and otherwise frail. There was also 2 reports in the literature about men with this was, I think, a part of Prendergast's work with vitamin D, where these men had gone off on their own, and one was taking 175,000 units of vitamin D a day, and the other one was taking 225,000 units of vitamin D a day for on average about 1 year. One of them was actually, the higher dose was more than a year. And one of the men had no sign of any kind of calcium deviation in his blood at all. And the other one was just slightly borderline, right on the edge of it. And so a lot of the misinformation about, vitamin D is based on, is counteracted or is contradicted by those experiences.
I would guess that the sort of moral of the story is, well, one, I haven't heard you guys say a brand, so I'm going to assume silence is to say nothing on that. And the other is to get measured.
Right.
And do it empirically. So take whatever you're taking, but go get measured. And if you're starting to get above 50, then that's probably more than you need.
Yeah, so another aspect of this is when you look at the general population, you're dealing with people who have, typically abysmal nutritional quality in their diet. Magnesium deficiency is rampant in our society. Calcium, not so much, because it tends to be supplemented. It's been, in a sense, adopted as the stepchild of the medical system. And everybody has this idea that, you want to build strong bones, you drink milk, which also is not true. But that's a really great way that an industry has, in a sense, sabotaged a or taken control of a market and twisted the message to serve their own financial interests.
Okay, I'm going to pick one more question here, which is
Good.
People may
And then we'll go on.
disagree with me. Well, there's a bunch of questions are actually about vitamin C and anticoagulation. So I think those will kind of come up later as you talk, Steve. So, and this one just kind of—
We're behind schedule, so I don't know.
Yeah. Well, there you go. See, well, we got 96 participants in this, so we're doing good. If someone suffers from fibromyalgia, does this mean they have ossification of their tissues? And maybe you can address, I mean—
Well, it wouldn't be ossification, it would be calcification, soft tissue calcification.
I think that's what they mean.
Yeah, and the answer is maybe. But, you know, we talked about vitamin D and autoimmune conditions, and I'm prepared to say that low metabolism relates to autoimmune conditions as well, autoimmune risks. So there's a lot of tie-in between these different kinds of factors. But for autoimmune diseases, it's a problem because the change from non-autoimmune to autoimmune is a kind of catastrophic change in mathematical sense of the word, where it's like you're on a cliff, at the top of a cliff, and you fall off the cliff and you go down to a state of autoimmunity, and you can't reverse it by going back up the cliff. You have to track yourself around, you know, and before you can get back to the top of the cliff where you don't have autoimmune disease, and therefore it's not it's a different path to get it, to reverse it, than it is to cause it. But oxidative stress and redox deficiencies are part of that mechanism. So that's beyond what we can talk about right here. So let me go on.
Okay, yeah, we'll continue on, and I'll try to.
Okay, so the next subject I want to talk about is selenium. And selenium is a trace element that's involved in the antioxidant defense system and redox defense system. It's incredibly inexpensive. The primary cellular redox pool is glutathione, and so that's a sulfur-based molecule, and selenium is right below sulfur, so it has a lot of the properties of sulfur, but it's different enough that we can use it for antioxidant defense, for augmenting the reducing power of sulfur, and for recycling and regenerating both our glutathione and our vitamin C. So the depth of your redox pool and how much oxidative stress you can withstand depends upon your selenium status, and that's a problem in, for example, central China. It's a massively selenium deficient region. In the United States, we have Michigan, and we have Oregon and Washington as examples of selenium deficient regions. The East Coast, the entire Atlantic Northeast is deficient in selenium. And so in the United States, our selenium status isn't so bad because a lot of our selenium is redistributed from the selenium belt, which is basically the northern plain states between Mississippi River and the Rocky Mountains, and the northern half, where, you know, South Dakota, Iowa, North Dakota, where those regions grow grain, which people in other areas eat. So if your grain is grown in South Dakota, it's got lots of selenium in it. If your grain is grown in Eastern Washington or Eastern Oregon, it has almost no selenium in it. And so who knows where their selenium is grown, but because it's shipped all over the country, it tends to average out. Let me get practical here for a second and talk about, well, let me mention before I go on that there's certain viruses that deplete selenium. HIV is one that has a minor selenium depletion mechanism. And Ebola viruses and Marburg virus, the hemorrhagic fevers, have a major selenium depleting feature built into their genome. And so in those kinds of situations, you have to aggressively supplement selenium, or minor supplementation for HIV, but major for the hemorrhagic fevers during the infection. But for most aspects of acute viral response to, let's say, coronavirus, you just want to have your selenium status be strong before we start. Was I interrupted?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, okay. I heard somebody's got their mic on. So there's a coronavirus mortality study that was done in China where they looked at Selenium and hair database and correlated it with a mortality database based on cities. So they had hair status in cities and mortality status, and they found that that high selenium reduced mortality. So they had in the high selenium, they had 61% of their patients survive coronavirus. And in the low selenium region, only 21% of them survived. These are people in hospitals with very, very serious infections. So this plays a big role, that your selenium status is almost constitutional, and in advance of the infection, you want to have your selenium status normalized, or maybe even in the top quintile, which is what I do. So selenium improves immune responses to live polio, viral vaccinations. Selenite is the inorganic form of selenium that you can buy, which is what I use as my primary source of selenium. It's hypoallergenic, and it's not cumulatively toxic at all. So if I want to double my dose, I just take another 100 microgram dose at a different time of the day. It's been suggested by one researcher that selenite is a possible spike protein inhibitor for the coronavirus, although that has not been followed up yet. The alternative selenium supplement is selenomethionine or selenocysteine, which are organic forms. These are not acutely toxic, but they are cumulatively toxic. And so I take 200 micrograms once a week for that, just to add a cumulative form of selenium in a fairly low dose. There are some people who publish studies saying that 300 micrograms a day may be slightly in the cumulative toxicity for total mortality for selenium. Vitamin A, powerful antiviral. Toxicity is grossly exaggerated by a 10,000 international unit upper tolerable limit for the United States. And yet 400,000 IUs are given to children with acute measles infections with 0 side effects. And 2 doses of 400,000 units is approaching 1 million doses. And that dose drops measles mortality for measles infection, acute measles infection, for kids that are hospitalized for this. It drops that mortality by 68%. Vitamin A promotes the health of the epithelial tissues along with zinc. That includes the lungs, the gut, the sinuses, the throat, bowel, etc. 2 researchers say that all children should be given vitamin A supplements, whether or not they are thought to have a nutritional deficiency. That was their research, that was their conclusion after looking at even milder forms of effective vitamin A on the course of measles infections. Forms of vitamin A would be, on one level, cod liver oil, where the vitamin A is free, and because it's not antioxidant protected, you have to taste test it on a regular basis for rancidity. The taste buds for rancidity are in the back center of your throat, where if you use a toothbrush and take some oil or vitamin A and put it on your toothbrush and brush the back center of your tongue, will induce a gagging response that's aggravated if the vitamin A and fish oils are rancid. I use vitamin A palmitate. The acetate is also available. These are esterified forms of vitamin A, which are much more stable for long-term use, and you can package them up and refrigerate them or freeze them if you don't know if you're going to catch the coronavirus this week or at the end of the year or whenever. Dose for women who are capable of getting pregnant is 4,000 to 7,000 IUs. This is above the level that is produced from beta carotene conversion to vitamin A. And whereas vitamin A is scalable to amplify your immune response, beta carotene is not. So if you scale beta carotene up, you're going to get a boomerang effect, and it's going to actually impair your immune system function. I think that in advance, I would recommend that people who, you know, when you have the colds or flus that are around, that are in your life, you've got, you know, a kid that's got the flu, or you've got somebody with, you know, you've been exposed to the coronavirus, that 10 to 15,000 IUs is an appropriate dose to prevent the infection. And during an infection, though, I think that this follows the vitamin D advice that you want to take higher doses, maybe 10 to 30,000 units or even 100,000 units as early as possible in the infection, and then drop the dose when the recovery starts. Next topic is zinc and copper. And there's a lot of publicity about zinc supplements for coronavirus. Zinc is very involved in the health of epithelial tissues and the lungs, throat, and sinuses. It's also involved in the tight junction gaps that are in the gut for, you know, minimizing leaky gut syndrome. But zinc has a problem in that it's antagonistic towards copper, and copper is a strong antiviral mineral that is a key element in both the antioxidant defense system and in the maturation of collagen in the extracellular spaces. And so my concern is that zinc lozenges and zinc supplements are possibly compromising the copper status of people. And vitamin C is also known to have a potential copper antagonism effect. And so what I've been doing is using transdermal copper. Here's an example of that product. This is called Ache Relief, and it's got enough copper in it. I don't know if you can see how blue that is. That's from the copper. Otherwise, it would be white or clear. And so this allows you to administer copper through a different tissue than the lungs and throat and sinuses and gut. And so you can supplement copper and zinc at the same time, but just have them go in through different tissues so that the antagonism isn't in advance of their bioavailability. So for transdermal zinc, you have lozenges, you have sprays. So for example, here's the 1 milligram per day zinc spray, one milligram per spray. And so you can administer that 15 times during the course of a day to improve the zinc status of your throat and your lungs. You can also do nebulization. You can also do suppositories for transdermal zinc. Copper can be applied as the copper cream that I just showed you, or lotions or peptides for skin absorption. You can actually buy commercial copper peptides and add them to your favorite cosmetics if you want. But keep in mind that both zinc and copper, when pushed to extreme, may be counterproductive. Okay, let's have 2 or 4 questions about zinc, copper, vitamin A, or selenium.
Okay, well, if somebody wants to jump in, please do. I think all of the questions pending are pretty much about vitamin C.
Okay, let's go on to vitamin C then. We've only got another half an hour, so it's good that we make that transition as fast as possible.
Okay, there's one question goes, my sodium selenite has some fish taste. Is this normal?
No, but selenium does have a taste when it's reduced. Selenium compounds are kind of like sulfur compounds in that when they get reduced, they have a stench. So you think skunks. So if you have a bottle of selenium that has that stench to it, put a couple of drops of of food grade hydrogen peroxide in it and see if it goes away.
Okay.
If it does, you can use it. Now, if you're seeing floating things inside the selenite, you should toss it. It means that, you know, some microbe is growing in it, and it's, you know, even though the microbe is probably not well adapted with that much selenium on board for causing human problems, I think you should probably just replace your selenite.
We have a couple other, I think they're fairly quick questions. So one is N-acetylcysteine versus selenium.
Well, they're totally different. N-acetylcysteine is sulfur-based. It's a direct support of glutathione levels. And if you're selenium deficient, it won't make a difference. It won't help the selenium deficiency. Your redox buffering system will still be fundamentally compromised.
Okay, and the two questions I want to combine. One is, well, clearly food sources, and then another one is suggested as speak to liver as a food source for vitamin A, and you could probably add vitamin E.
Zinc and selenium and copper. Yeah, I mean, organ meats are rich sources for all of those, and so is shellfish. I mean, that's one of the arguments for the aquatic theory, is that humans, when we were making this transition to bigger brains and an aquatic lifestyle, we were diving for shellfish as a major food source, and that's actually been found in some of these sites where, you know, pre-human cultures were thriving. So, you know, those are great ways to get it. And the classic way is Brazil nuts. In Africa, there are Zika nuts and Gabon nuts, and but in Brazil, they have Brazil nut trees that are selenium concentrators. The problem is that there was one study where they looked at 5 different zones of Brazil nut growth in Brazil, and 2 of them had high selenium. One of them was kind of medium, and the last 2, it was minor. And so in the selenium-rich area, you eat 1 Brazil nut a day. And in the 2 minor things, you have to eat 20 Brazil nuts a day. And so who knows where your Brazil nuts were grown. So there is a fundamental problem with Brazil nuts, in that if you have a very, very potent set of them, you could eat too much and be over the hump of the selenium curve.
Okay, well, we're getting more. I think the interest in vitamin C is pretty high, so we'll leave it there and move on to vitamin C.
Okay, first of all, vitamin C is highly political, and it's highly political in many regions of the world. And part of this is because the United States exports their idiocy about vitamin C. But it's not limited. You know, for example, in Australia, their attitude towards vitamin C was highly resistant following a doctor's experience. Dr. Kalakarinos was a doctor who knew about vitamin C, and he found that when he was in this region, that the Aboriginals would you know, population on in a sense, food stamps, the US equivalent, they were subsidized by the government, and the government would come in and vaccinate all the kids, and their sudden infant death rate was 50%. So he wrote a book called Every Other Child and published it, and embarrassed the Australian public health people. And they never forgave him for that. And so he would go in the day after the vaccinations and give vitamin C injections, and he only lost 1 infant during his entire time of doing that for 2 years. So he took the SIDS rate from 50% to 0% merely by giving vitamin C injections. And so when he exposed this, it was a big scandal, and the public health people knew nothing about it. They were just completely oblivious and couldn't even do any follow-up. And as a result, it was kind of a genocide. Maybe unintentional, but this is one of those things that I read about back in the 70s that caused me to start looking into the issues of vaccination and vaccination injury, And it turns out it's the same thing that happens when you catch coronavirus. You have this oxidative stress, a strain on your vitamin C pool, and which collapses earlier than all the other parts like glutathione or selenium or vitamin A. This got me to look into vitamin C, and I met a huge number of doctors and talked with them extensively about their experience with vitamin C. And it's basically, they wouldn't even consider doing a double-blind placebo-controlled study. It would be utterly unethical for them to do that because they know beyond a shadow of a doubt that vitamin C is effective, and withholding it from anybody would be a medical crime and a violation of their Hippocratic oath. So in New Zealand, there's still an entrenched attitude, even though the near death of Alan Smith at the hands of the ICU people in New Zealand was massively publicized, and a law was passed mandating that intravenous vitamin C be on their approved procedures list. They still resent the fact that it was taken out of their hands and that their judgment was overruled. So there's a lot of this institutional resistance to such an extent that your chances of finding intravenous vitamin C in a hospital are about 1/10 of 1% at this point. So why is vitamin C the limiting factor? So I mentioned before, mammals produce, let's say, 10 to 20 grams of vitamin C, and we're lucky if we get 100 milligrams. So that's a 100-to-1 ratio between what other mammals have and we have. Also, the mammals double their vitamin C when they're infected, and humans cannot do this. So our vitamin C intake goes to 0.1% or a fifth of a percent, a third of a percent when we get infected. So that means our vitamin C buffering pool is shallow. It's intrinsically shallow for genetic reasons, and we can't eat enough food that would raise our vitamin C level to what would be close to what a mammal, fellow mammal would have. This has actually been demonstrated in the gorilla population in the United States that are in zoos. Due to financial stresses, the zoos were feeding their gorillas human food, and they had, and I think are still having, an epidemic of cardiovascular disease in the gorillas. And when the experts came in, these were experts that based their judgment on human RDAs of vitamin C. They didn't figure out what was going on. And so this problem kept going because the experts weren't experts on vitamin C. So the depth of the vitamin C redox pool, the strength of the vitamin C redox buffering system is, it depends on the recycling of vitamin C. So the vitamin C gets oxidized and our bodies recycle it. And that recycling process, it depends on our metabolic rate. So if we have insulin resistance, our metabolic rate is compromised. If we have diabetes, it's compromised. If we have lead poisoning from decades of breathing air with leaded fuel fumes in it, our recycling is compromised. If we're old, we lose about 1/3% of our metabolism every year just from aging. So our recycling of vitamin C goes down with age. So it's sabotaged by amalgam dental fillings, by fluoride dental treatments. Recycling is sabotaged by inflammation, allergy, infections. It's sabotaged by insulin resistance and diabetes, and also leptin resistance. Deficiencies of B1, B2, B3, lipoic acid, lack of exercise of beta oxidation and ketosis, and the consumption of high carb diets, regular consumption of high carb diets. And this is this is so unrecognized by our doctors and our medical profession that when somebody is hospitalized and put on IV therapy for fluids, for hydration purposes, more often than not, D5W is used, which is glucose-based intravenous fluid for replacing your electrolytes and water. And so you're put on a IV supplement that totally suppresses beta oxidation and ketosis and impairs the recycling of vitamin C. So vitamin C, medium dose IV vitamin C has been used in China to dramatically decrease mortality. That's the Shanghai Protocol. Medium dose IVC has been used in multiple US hospitals where the doctors discovered the use of vitamin C for sepsis and then prove it to their satisfaction and then transferred that to coronavirus successfully. And so those would be renegades who are probably now being character assassinated by the public health people. And so this group of hospitals, they formed a group and kind of a treatment society, and they started standardizing all their patients, and they had 0 deaths for their first month of operation. Nobody on IV vitamin C died. Not only that, they had 100% survival of their ventilation cases. Nobody died on a ventilator. And in most situations without vitamin C, the fatality rates can be upwards of 80%. Interestingly enough, in talking about institutional malfeasance in the campaign, Bill, thank you for that. The FDA just forced a 10-fold price increase on intravenous vitamin C in the United States. So what used to cost $30 now costs more than $500. Okay, so let me take it back to what to do at home. Because you can't get vitamin C from doctors, you can't get it from in the hospitals because of institutional prejudice. You can do it at home based on your own recognizance. So I think that these will match these medium dose IV studies that have been done in China and the United States. They involve a total of 12 to 24 grams a day, and that's well within what humans can take when we're infected. The gut absorption of vitamin C is proportional to the severity of the infection and the depletion of vitamin C reserves. So if your vitamin C goes down, your gut absorption goes up. And as the disease increases in severity, your vitamin C absorption increases proportionally. So this is one way you can track yourself. Otherwise, you know, you can just look at your fever maybe or how you feel. But this idea that vitamin C absorption changes with the degree of infection has been supported by every medical doctor who has successfully integrated vitamin C into their practice, both oral and IV. They all say this. And not only that, that the dose of vitamin C predicts the clinical outcome and the time of recovery. So Alan Smith, for example, the man in New Zealand who was in a induced coma with whiteout lungs. That means that with an X-ray, you can't even see the lungs because they're filled with fluid. When he was put on 50 grams of vitamin C by IV twice a day, 24 hours later, his lungs were visibly clear. So from going from whiteout lungs to air-filled lungs in 24 hours with 100 grams of vitamin C in 2 separate doses. That's phenomenal recovery. Yet the ICU people in New Zealand, well, the consultant who was brought in afterwards to shut it all down did not consider that significant. So here's my protocol. Number 1, get a kitchen timer. Set a start time, let's say 90 minutes or 120 minutes, and then take a starting dose of vitamin C, whatever that is for you. Could be a gram. Let's just say it's a gram in a capsule.
Steve, are you talking about the protocol when you have initial symptoms? Are you talking about?
Yes.
Okay.
This is be designed. I mean, there's no reason why you couldn't do this for any kind of oxidative stress, but this is specific when you want to shut down the coronavirus as fast as possible. As soon as you think you've got it, you start this process. And if you're wrong and you don't have it, what'll happen is you'll get diarrhea and you'll know, okay, you know, your dose of vitamin C, absorption of vitamin C will stay low. So there's no reason why you can't do this anytime you want. It's called a bowel tolerance dosing of vitamin C, and it is self-limiting because of the diarrhea, stool loosening effect. So you take your dose of vitamin C, swallow your 1 gram of vitamin C, start the timer, and when the timer goes off, you take another dose of vitamin C. So the timer is separating your doses of vitamin C by that particular set time that you're doing. Now, if you did have a stool loosening effect, you set the timer for 5 or 10 more minutes. Okay, so you're extending the time because your dose of vitamin C is low. It's being absorbed as low. If you did not have a stool loosening effect, you set the timer for 5 to 10 minutes less. And so you go through this loop, you're taking your 1 gram of vitamin C at 90 minutes, and then at 80 minutes, and then at 70 minutes, and then at 60 minutes, and 50 minutes. And when you get down to 20 or 30 minutes, all of a sudden you have a stool loosening effect. Now you've reached your bowel tolerance and you know it. So as the course of the infection gets worse, you know, you're adjusting it 5 minutes less, you know, when the diarrhea goes away, or 5 minutes more when the diarrhea comes back, the stool loosening effect comes back. So you're actively responding to it in a way that's very, very convenient because the time is very easy to judge, but making a dose of vitamin C to a specific number is difficult. You don't have to get out a scale and weigh it. You don't have to count capsules and say, remember, oh, I took 5, 2 hours ago, and now it's, 2 hours and 15 minutes, so maybe I should take 6. You're not always second guessing yourself. And if you've got a fever and you've got a little bit of cognitive dementia because of a high fever, a timer is so simple that you might be able to tough this out on your own, but it's certainly the thing that any kind of what you call a caregiver can easily follow that kind of protocol. It's incredibly simple. Even a high school kid can easily adjust timing. And so, if you really have the coronavirus and you're down to taking a dose of vitamin C every 10 minutes, a gram of vitamin C every 10 minutes or something like that, and that is too inconvenient for you, what you can do is double the dose and double the time. So instead of taking 1 capsule every 10 minutes, you're taking 2 capsules every 20 minutes, or 3 capsules every 30 minutes. So that's one way to handle the massive doses where you could be taking 20, 30, or 40 grams a day, where you can do it in a more convenient way. So at some point, you'll reach a point when the fever breaks and the viral infection switches from an increasing infection to a decreasing infection, and you're starting to recover. At that point, you're going to get a stool loosening effect, and you're going to have to start extending the time. So your times, instead of switch from getting shorter and shorter and shorter to getting longer and longer and longer. And the longer they get, the faster you're recovering. That tells you the degree of how you're recovering. So when you're asleep, when you wake up, you resume. Whatever dose you took before you went to sleep, you do the same dose when you wake up and start the timer and continue on your way the next day. If you wake up in the middle of the night and the timer has already gone off and you slept through it, just take a dose, start the timer, and go back to sleep. This is what works for me. It's my protocol. I also take liposomal vitamin C, and I use the Live On brand when the doses get really high and I need an extra push. And even though there aren't any studies that look at the comparison between the liposomal and the intravenous vitamin C, at least Alan Smith when he was switched from intravenous vitamin C to liposomal C, he had the same acceleration of his recovery.
So I have a question for you. Let's say you're at the state where you really need to use IV vitamin C. And the last thing you want to do is go to El Camino or Stanford Hospital because A, you're not going to get it. And who knows
They'll keep
else.
you away from your oral C.
Correct. But where can I find a practitioner, a clinic in the Bay Area that believes in the IV and is willing to administer it and you can do it?
There isn't one.
There isn't anyone.
There isn't one. Even the clinics like Riordan or whatever who do intravenous vitamin C regularly, they typically will not take on a coronavirus case because of the fear of cross-infecting the rest of their patients.
So there's, Christine says that Pacific Neuropathic in Mountain View will do IV vitamin C.
Excellent. Yeah, Christine, would you type that into the chat window for everybody? Now,
that's where I read it.
Good, okay. So if you're listening to this and there's important information in the chat window, on that, at the bottom of the chat window, there's a little box with 3 dots in it. If you click on that, it'll give you the option of saving the chat on your computer. So I'd suggest that before you sign off, that you save the chat so that you can refer to it, not have to watch the video in a month.
Wow, great. I just learned something very useful. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Steve, got a lot of questions.
Go on, more questions about vitamin C.
Are you ready to, are you about wrapped up here?
For vitamin C, yes. And I'm not going to go into studies and you know, for all the different things where things have been controlled or blinded or stuff like that. I'm not going to do that now. I just wanted to make this actionable in your life, like it is in mine.
Great. So we probably won't be able to go on to another section that you had talked about.
Well, we've got 15 minutes left, and
we'll
it's
see.
probably a perfect time for answering questions. But
Right.
if we run out of questions, I'll talk something about
Yeah.
basal metabolic rate.
Okay, we'll try to keep your questions kind of compact, but there are a lot of them. First, I want to go back to some earlier questions actually were coming out. There's some interest in talking about vitamin C in relationship to cancer and chemotherapy. So if you could address those two to start with.
It's obvious to me that redox potential and redox management are an intrinsic part of cellular malfunctions. Whether those malfunctions are from a viral infection or from a cancer process, I don't think it matters. But vitamin C has been shown to be effective in cancer and helpful in cancer, and it's probably a good adjunctive therapy for any other kind of cancer protocol. So you can stack vitamin C on top of radiation, you can stack it on top of surgery, you can stack it on top of chemo. However, it will alter the dose for the chemo and the radiation, and it will dramatically improve the healing from the surgery. Vitamin C is the limiting factor not only in redox defense, it's a limiting factor in terms of collagen maturation, and collagen maturation is the essential process for healing wounds without scars. So that's why humans have really nasty scars, is because we run out of vitamin C early and then have fibrosis to facilitate healing and tissue trauma.
Okay.
So fibrosis would be the basis of lung pathology, the basis of kidney damage, the basis of heart disease in gorillas. So fibrosis is one of the consequences of clotting, pre-clotting changes, which we call coagulopathy, that may not actually develop all the way into clotting. But for coronavirus, clotting is definitely identified as a risk factor.
Are you aware of any contraindications for vitamin C? A friend psychologist told him not to take it while being treated for prostate cancer. Anything specific?
I don't know of that. I don't know of any contraindications to it. There's all kinds of things that people will say. There's one that's been discussed, and that is copper. Vitamin C appears to oppose copper, and copper is involved in all kinds of processes, including collagen maturation and antioxidant defense. And so it's certainly possible, and certainly vitamin C would be contraindicated in hemochromatosis, where you have toxic levels of iron, and the iron and vitamin C react to form hydroxyl radicals, which are in the magenta part of that circle that I just showed earlier. They're one of the most dangerous and non-selective free radicals that there is.
Okay.
So for copper, if you take copper supplementally, I think that minimizes that risk, which is why I would do transdermal copper every day in addition to the vitamin C.
Mm-hmm. All right.
Let's see, in other terms of vitamin C, there's a lot of claims about oxalate and as a risk factor for stones, both potentially gallbladder stones and kidney stones. And even though I'm open to the possibility that small increases in vitamin C might increase that risk, from the oxidation of vitamin C all the way from the vitamin C radical, which is halfway oxidized, to the full oxidized vitamin C, that would then degrade into oxalate and increase your risks of stones or gout. But it appears that every time I know where vitamin C has been studied in high doses, the stone formation goes to zero.
Alfonso asks, it seems that the FLCCC is advocating for corticosteroids concomitant with the vitamin C. Yeah, that word.
Yeah, and that's part of the shutting down the immune system. And this was developed from their sepsis protocol, and it's a holdover from that protocol. But vitamin C itself shuts down the cytokine storm and shuts down the inflammatory response, normalizes the inflammatory response. So I don't think the corticosteroid is necessary. But short-term corticosteroid is not particularly harmful. It's chronic corticosteroid use that is really will bite you. And so that's, you know, I think they're probably using more corticosteroid than they need to.
Okay, can you speak to protocols for folks who have Epstein-Barr or other retroviruses and say Lyme or co-infections?
Yeah, the previous book I wrote, called the BHT book, which is about chronic viral disease as opposed to acute viral disease, goes into a lot of that kind of thing. Now, all the things that I've talked about here in terms of vitamin C and selenium and vitamin A, those are also beneficial for chronic viral diseases, like herpes or CMV or Epstein-Barr virus. It's a good news that it's almost 2 hours. My throat's starting to affect my voice.
Okay, good. Let's kind of roll this. So there's been several questions or comments about different kinds of vitamin C. What's the best kind to take? You've mentioned liposomal vitamin C, powder. I guess you could throw that tablets. There's another one, thoughts of nebulizing sodium ascorbate. What about these different kinds?
Yeah. So the liposomal vitamin C comes in packets, and it's made with alcohol and lecithin as
Hold it closer so they can see it. That's good. Okay.
And so what you do is you just take the packet. It's got a little tear mark on one side. There it goes. So I squeeze it away, and then I tear off the top, and it's very thick, like honey. And it's a perfect thing. I do this anytime I have a scratchy throat or feel like maybe I've been exposed to something and caught it. And I typically use just one packet. And I'll use half of it or a third of it, and then I'll wait 10 or 20, 30 minutes, and I'll do another half or third, and then maybe wait for doing the final third, to spread it out so that it coats my throat like you would do if you had a zinc lozenge. You know, you suck on it, dissolves, and it coats your throat on the way down, and then it's absorbed into those tissues, and that zinc improves the immune response. You can do the same thing with vitamin A to improve your immune response in your throat. Getting it into your sinuses, now that's an entirely different kind of challenge. We don't have any way of squirting something like that up into the sinuses. I suppose it could be diluted into water and nebulized, but I've never done that, so I can't advise people on that.
Yeah, the comment about nebulizing sodium ascorbate, so it's be interesting to learn more about that.
Yeah, the regular vitamin C issue is basically one of pH.
Yeah.
So I tend to be alkaline stress at the blood level, and so I just take plain ascorbic acid, cheapest, most readily available form of vitamin C on the market. I have it in powdered form if I need it, and I have it in capsule form, and I have enough to save 3 people's lives with coronavirus, one of which would be me. But if you don't tolerate acid, you have acid stress blood, then you may want to use sodium ascorbate or a mixture of sodium ascorbate and ascorbic acid that's buffered to your taste. And if you're taking it in capsule form, it doesn't matter about the taste. But if you're drinking it as a you know, just stirring the powder into water and drinking it, you need to buffer it to your taste, because pure vitamin C would be like drinking lemon juice, and even green lemon juice, you know, really, really on the tart side.
Okay, let's try
And
to.
it will also damage your teeth from the acute acidity. So you need to buffer it, whether you buffer it to lemon juice, or you buffer it to orange juice, or you buffer it to fully neutral. That's a matter of personal taste. And you can use calcium ascorbate to do mineral buffering. You can use magnesium ascorbate to do mineral buffering. I have that as a supplement too that I do, so that I can take magnesium and vitamin C in the same supplement. And you can also use baking soda to convert ascorbic acid into sodium ascorbate, and you can use milk of magnesia to convert ascorbic acid into magnesium ascorbate. It takes about 30 seconds for the magnesium oxide particles in milk of magnesia to convert to magnesium ascorbate. And you'll notice it because it'll go from milky white color to a translucent kind of white color, milkiness.
Okay, all right. I think at this point I'll ask people, I mean, put comments or questions in there for maybe we can answer them online, but we've got more
We're
than
down to the last 5 minutes, so
the last 5 minutes. So let's see where I'm coming. Let me pack. I love how this window keeps jumping to the end when somebody posts something, so I have to scroll back.
well, if you enlarge your screen vertically, you can actually see more of the chat.
Yeah. Okay, so pardon me. All right, comment. Matt Cook at BioReset in Campbell also does vitamin C IV. What do you think
of coronavirus cases?
Yeah, what do you think of elderberry extract, since antiviral but is a cytokine booster?
Well, many things that modify cytokines will boost one and suppress another. This is not, the immune system is not monolithic. You've even got the cell immunity and adaptive immunity responses that are inversely associated with each other. So, you know, anytime somebody says online, this improves immune function, it also suppresses immune function, because, you know, again, these responsiveness. So it's not about improvement and all, it's about the efficiency of the targeting and having a good outcome to know your immune system is balanced the way it's supposed to. So when it's responding to things, it's responding functionally. And cytokine storm is the epitome of the malfunction.
All right. If someone wears copper bracelets or wears copper lined knee braces, does this help?
Yes, but the amount that you can absorb through the skin without aid is trivial. So, you know, maybe that matters with somebody with arthritis, that you can get enough copper in. But one application of ache relief, will give you a year's copper from a copper bracelet.
That's great. I always enjoy watching the commercials because I see on TV there's like all this like copper fit braces and stuff like that. And then I watch them put the brace on top of their shirt or whatever.
Well, there were people promoting
you're not getting
copper countertops for your kitchen and copper fixtures for your bathroom and your doorknob, so that anytime somebody with coronavirus on their hand touched your doorknob, the copper would kill the coronavirus.
Yeah, that'd be great.
So, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of
okay.
over exaggeration.
Yeah. Comment, gout is due to uric acid, which is also important to keep copper and zinc ratio optimal. Agreed.
Yes. Uric acid is one of the primary human adaptations to a lack of vitamin C. So we have less vitamin C and more uric acid, which is why we're plagued by gout.
Do digestive enzymes treat viruses and does protease?
Don't know. Good question.
All right. Another comment, vitamin C is not recommended when undergoing radiation for cancer because the basis of radiation is to kill the cancer cells by oxidative damage. And vitamin C is an antioxidant, reducing oxidative damage, which.
That's right.
So if you want to get the most out of your radiation, you want to separate them, right?
Well, no, because you can take vitamin C and increase the dose of radiation, get better clinical efficacy. So one of the problems that people have with radiation therapy is their hair falls out. So let's say they've got, hand cancer. They get their hand irradiated and all their hair falls out. Well, that wouldn't happen if you took large doses of vitamin C and increased the radiation to the hand so that the oxidative stress in the hand was fully buffered. It wouldn't spread to the rest of your body and cause your hair to fall out.
Okay.
Now, if you have brain cancer and we're getting head irradiation, the vitamin C wouldn't stop your hair from falling out because it's localized effect. But that's one of the things about the redox pool, is that the stronger your redox pool is, the more localized your immune system is, the more focused it is on the site of an infection. So if you have oxidative stress and your vitamin C is being challenged and your vitamin C pool is low, whatever oxidative stress you have is going to spread throughout your entire body instead of being localized. So if you skin your knee, your immune system is not going to focus on your knee, it's going to focus on everything. And then that allows it to misidentify things and you become autoimmune.
Okay, great. Well, let's see. Interesting question here. Does hydrogen prevent cytokine storm?
Oh, well, there's hydrogen and then there's hydride. And they're different, totally different. Hydrogen is a moderately strong reducing agent that's very unreactive. And you produce it every day in your body to different degrees, and it cycles with what you eat. And that's not a strong reducing agent. And to date, even though there have been significant clinical improvements identified, nobody knows what the mechanism is, because it appears that 99.99% of the hydrogen goes in, comes back out again.
Okay,
but hydride is a reactive form of hydrogen. It's like NADH and glutathione. It's an extra electron, and it's very reactive. And it would depend on how you administer it. I suspect that very little of it survives the process of assimilation to get down to the level that you need for viral infections, which is cellular and subcellular. But it might treat the vitamin C in the tissues, because that's a little bit more superficial, and you might get the hydride coming down to that level. But every time it goes through the gut lining, a lot of the reducing power is lost, and then it goes into the blood, more is lost, and it goes into the tissues and more is lost. So it's a question of how do you get the reducing power to where it really matters.
Okay.
And so if you put hydride in your throat and mouth, it's going to work fine.
Okay. Let's, I want to answer a couple of questions. So the presentation actually, there's a redo tomorrow morning. If somebody really want that, you want to tell them really quickly about that?
It's on my Facebook. The instructions are on my Facebook posting.
And they're for Stephen Fowkes.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, and then
one with the blue picture, and that's my international one, my non-localized one.
So this recording will be published on the Silicon Valley Health Institute, like our other programs are. So you can get it there.
But we don't know when it's going to be ready, because the Zoom format is different, potentially different from what Eric has done in the past.
We'll see. Okay. And there's one last question. I think well, let's this last question, and then you'll have the last word, which is UV light effective against COVID-19?
Well, it'll kill the virus. If the virus is on a surface or on your hand and stuff like that, yes. But UV light in and of itself is toxic enough that you're probably the most benefit you're going to get is from the vitamin D that you get from the UVB rays.
Okay, so we'll leave it there then.
Thank you all.
Okay, thank you. And that's the end.
Wow, 82 people managing Hank's.
Dropping fast. I think we're at like 96 at one point, somewhere around there.
Yeah, okay. Well, thank you all for joining, and stay healthy.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
מה את אומרת?
Good night. Thank you, Steve.
לא, הולך למטה.